cleaning lady picks up a call and speaks Dutch. A millionaire overhears her. The same millionaire who used to ignore her is now frozen in shock at what he just discovered. But before we tell you this story, make sure to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The sun had barely risen when Helen Santos crossed through the imposing gates of the Luxor Hotel, one of the most prestigious properties in the Royal Hotels chain in Manhattan. The 60-story building reflected the first golden rays in its mirrored windows, creating an almost ironic contrast with the simplicity of the subway that had brought her there after an hour-and-a-half journey from the outer boroughs of Queens. Her steps were silent, like her very existence in that environment, a carefully choreographed dance to not disturb the natural order of things. At 28 years old, Helen carried in her deep brown eyes the weight of a lifetime of silent observation. Her face, free of makeup, held delicate features that were rarely noticed beneath her meticulously pressed navy blue uniform. Her long black hair was always tied in a low, discreet bun, as protocol demanded. Not that anyone really paid attention to these details. The women's locker room in the basement was her first destination, as on all mornings for the past 3 years. There, among grey metal lockers and whispered conversations of other employees, Helen stored her worn bag, a faithful companion that carried much more than personal hygiene products. Between carefully organized compartments, a world was hidden that no one there suspected existed. Philosophy books in different languages, notebooks with meticulous notes from her virtual Dutch classes, and a small velvet box that guarded her greatest achievement until then, an academic medal from Columbia University, where she had graduated with honors in international relations before life pushed her toward other paths. "Good morning, Helen." The cheerful voice of Ms. Sophia, a 60-year-old woman who worked in the laundry, echoed through the locker room. She was one of the few people who really noticed her, perhaps because they shared that same social invisibility. Already studying. That strange language so early. Helen smiled, closing the Dutch grammar book she was discreetly leafing through. "Always, Ms. Sophia. Every minute counts." Her voice was soft, but carried a determination that few perceived. While organizing her cleaning cart with her usual precision, her mind wandered to the memory of her mother, Mrs. Grace, who had passed away 5 years ago, leaving only a small hummingbird brooch as inheritance, a simple piece, already oxidized by time, which was now always pinned to the inside of her uniform, close to her heart. The routine began on the 40th floor, in the executive suites. Helen moved through the corridors like an efficient shadow, her cart gliding silently over the dark red carpet. Years of practice had taught her the perfect rhythm, 15 minutes per empty room, 20 when occupied, always avoiding encounters with guests. It was a solitary dance she had perfected, an invisible ballet through the luxurious corridors. That morning, while cleaning suite 4015, her ears caught a conversation in English coming from the hallway. 2 executives were discussing a corporate merger, mentioning terms that to any other cleaning staff would be incomprehensible, but to Helen made perfect sense. Merger and acquisition strategies, holding companies, offshore accounts, words that danced in her mind along with the economic theories she studied in solitary dawns. It was when her cell phone vibrated. An international number. It was her Dutch teacher, a retired gentleman who gave online classes in exchange for symbolic fees. Helen hesitated, looking at the suite's landline phone. It was against the rules to use room phones, but the cell signal on that floor was practically non-existent, and that call could be about the results of the proficiency exam she had taken the previous week, her possible bridge to the much-dreamed-of position at the Dutch consulate. After a moment of hesitation, she answered using the room's phone. "Goedemorgen, Professor van der Meer." Her voice flowed naturally in the language she had practiced so much. The conversation that followed was brief, but each word in Dutch was pronounced with the precision of someone who had dedicated countless hours of study. The professor was euphoric. She had achieved the maximum score on the exam, a rare accomplishment for a non-native speaker. What Helen didn't realize, absorbed in her contained joy, was that she wasn't alone. At the suite door, partially hidden, stood Marcus Rivera, the owner of the Royal Hotels chain. Tall, with his 55 well-lived years, grey hair and an impeccable suit, He had arrived for a surprise inspection and was about to reprimand the improper use of the telephone when the fluency in the foreign language caught him by surprise. Marcus remained silent, observing that employee who, until then, was just another navy blue uniform in the corridors of his empire. Now, for the first time he truly saw her, the elegant posture even during a domestic task, the intelligence that shone in her eyes while she conversed in such a complex language, the silent dignity that emanated from every gesture. Helen finished the call, and turning around, her heart almost stopped when she saw the hotel owner. Blood drained from her face, and her hands began to tremble slightly. I'm sorry, sir, I know I shouldn't." But before she could complete her explanation, Marcus raised his hand in a gentle gesture of interruption. "How long have you been speaking Dutch?" he asked, his deep voice carrying more curiosity than reprimand. 2 years, sir," Helen replied, keeping her gaze lowered, but her voice remained firm. "I study every morning before work." "And why Dutch?" The question came accompanied by a step forward, reducing the social distance that separated them. Helen hesitated for a moment, but something in his tone encouraged her. "There's a position at the consulate. They need someone fluent in the language. It was my goal." Marcus absorbed that information in silence, his eyes scanning the cleaning cart, the products organized with military precision, the Dutch grammar book partially visible in one of the compartments. "How many languages do you speak?" 4. "Sir, Portuguese, English, Spanish, and Dutch." Each word was a confession, a small revelation of a universe she kept carefully hidden. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with unspoken possibilities. Marcus Rivera was known for his instinct for talent, for his ability to see potential where others saw only the ordinary. And at that moment, something was changing in the air conditioning of Suite 4015, something that would forever alter the course of 2 lives. "Meet me in the executive office tomorrow at 9 o'clock, he finally said, his voice taking on a professional tone that left no room for questions. "Bring your resume." Before Helen could fully process what was happening, Marcus had already turned to leave, but he stopped at the door, looking over his shoulder. "And congratulations on your exam score. It's not every day someone gets a perfect score in Dutch." When the door closed, Helen remained motionless for several minutes, her heart beating like an erratic drum. The small hummingbird brooch seemed to burn against her chest, as if her mother were there, witnessing that turning point. Her hands found the small metal piece, and her fingers traced the familiar contours of the bird. "Being good is different from being seen," her mother's voice echoed in her memory. But for the first time in her life, Helen allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, it was possible to be both. The executive office of the Luxor Hotel occupied half of the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. Helen arrived 20 minutes before the scheduled time, her heart beating against the hummingbird brooch that, for the first time, was pinned to the outside of her clothes. No longer the navy blue uniform, but a simple black dress she had bought at a department store the night before, spending almost all her emergency savings. The contrast between her worlds had never been so evident as that morning. Her hands, still slightly rough from work with cleaning products, held a folder with her resume. Pages that told a story of resistance and determination that few there could understand. The receptionist looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, as if trying to decipher what kind of business a person like her could have on that floor. At 9 o'clock sharp, the double mahogany doors opened. Marcus Rivera wasn't alone. Beside him, Arthur Mendez, the senior director of international operations, emanated an aura of poorly disguised disapproval. He was a man in his 40s, known for his traditionalist stance and for fiercely defending corporate hierarchy. "Good morning, Helen." Marcus's voice sounded warm, contrasting with the austere environment. "Please come in." The meeting room was a monument to corporate power. A gigantic mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by black leather chairs and walls decorated with contemporary artwork. Helen sat where indicated, conscious of every movement, as if she were still performing that silent dance of the hotel corridors. "Miss Santos," Arthur began, his condescending tone cutting through the air. "I understand you had an interesting conversation with Mr. Rivera yesterday, but I need to express my concern about any hasty decisions. After all, experience and proper training are essential for executive positions." Helen felt blood rush to her face, but maintained her composure. She opened her folder with studied calm and withdrew her resume, along with a copy of her cum laude degree in international relations from Columbia and certificates of proficiency in 4 languages. "Actually, Mr. Mendez," her voice came out, clear and firm, surprising even herself, "I believe my training is quite adequate for any junior executive position. What I've lacked until now have been opportunities, not qualifications." Marcus couldn't contain a small smile while leafing through the documents. Arthur, on the other hand, seemed to have swallowed something particularly bitter. "And why, with all these good qualifications, did you choose to work on the cleaning staff?" The question hung in the air like a veiled accusation. Helen breathed deeply, her fingers unconsciously finding the hummingbird brooch. "When my mother passed away, there were medical bills to pay. Insurance didn't cover everything. I needed immediate work and the hotel was hiring, but I never stopped studying, preparing myself. Every free moment was a learning opportunity." Marcus interrupted before Arthur could continue his interrogation. "Helen, we're expanding our operations in Europe, Netherlands specifically. We need someone who understands not just the language, but the culture, the nuances of international business. Your training in international relations, combined with your knowledge of Dutch, is exactly what we were looking for." "With all due respect, Marcus," Arthur intervened, "there are candidates with years of corporate experience who don't know our operation from the inside like she does," Marcus completed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Helen, I'm offering you a position as junior executive in the International Expansion Department. I know it's a drastic change, but I believe in your potential." The silence that followed was deafening. Helen could feel the weight of gazes upon her, Marcus's expectation, Arthur's disapproval, and something more. Something that seemed to vibrate in the air between her and the man who was offering her this unlikely opportunity. "When do I start?" Her answer was simple, direct, carrying in 2 words all the weight of a lifetime of waiting. "Monday," Marcus smiled, ignoring Arthur's sour expression. "We'll provide your new badge, system access, and you'll have this week to make the transition. Arthur will be your direct supervisor." The last part of the sentence fell like a bomb in the environment. Arthur adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. "Certainly, it will be a pleasure to guide you." When the meeting ended, Helen stood with the same silent grace she had developed over the years. But something had changed. Her gaze was no longer directed at the floor, and her steps, although still soft, carried a new confidence. Marcus accompanied her to the door. "Helen," he called when she was already leaving, "why haven't you accepted the consulate position yet, with the perfect score? On the exam you must have been first on the list." She stopped, turning partially. "The result came out yesterday, Mr. Rivera. I hadn't decided yet. And now," a small smile appeared on her lips, "now I have a different decision to make." When the elevator doors closed, Helen finally allowed the tears to come. They weren't tears of sadness or fear, but of an emotion she couldn't name, a mixture of gratitude, determination, and something more, something that made her heart beat faster when she thought of Marcus Rivera's intense eyes. In the elevator mirror, her reflection showed a woman who was beginning to emerge from the shadows. The hummingbird brooch shone under the lights, no longer hidden but exposed as a symbol of transformation. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, but now with a new meaning. Being good was different from being seen, but maybe, just maybe, she could be both. What Helen didn't know as the elevator descended to the floor where her old life awaited her for one last goodbye was that her journey was just beginning, and that the path ahead would be much more complex, challenging and emotionally intense than any romance she had ever read in her solitary nights of study. Helen's first week as a junior executive was an avalanche of new experiences and veiled challenges. Her new office, although modest compared to others on the same floor, was larger than the entire apartment where she lived. The view of the city now came from a different perspective, no longer through the windows she cleaned, but from her own window, which she could open or close whenever she wanted. Morning started later, but ended long after sunset. Her hands, once calloused by cleaning products, now glided over laptop keys and tablet screens, preparing presentations and analyzing reports. The navy blue uniform had been replaced by women's suits bought in installments, and her hair, now loose, framed a face that was beginning to learn to smile more. But not everything was roses in the corporate garden of the Luxor Hotel. Arthur. Mendez had become a constant shadow in her professional life, always present with an acid comment or a veiled criticism. Team meetings were exercises in patience and resistance, where every word of hers was dissected in search of flaws. "Miss Santos?" Arthur's voice cut through the silence during a presentation about Dutch expansion. "Your numbers seem too optimistic. Perhaps your limited experience is affecting your analysis." Helen maintained her composure, her fingers unconsciously touching the hummingbird brooch. That was now her trademark. "Actually, Mr. Mendez, these numbers are based on a detailed analysis of the Amsterdam hotel market over the past 5 years. I can show the data that supports each projection." It was at that moment that Marcus Rivera, who was watching the presentation by video conference from London, intervened. "Impressive work, Helen. Your analysis aligns with what I've been observing here in Europe. Arthur, I think we can trust her competence, can't we?" The flush that rose up Arthur's neck didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. But it was the look that Marcus directed at Helen through the screen that made her heart skip a beat. There was something there, a mixture of pride and something deeper, something she didn't allow herself to name. The weeks turned into months, and Helen began to put down roots in her new world, but she didn't forget her origins. During lunch breaks, she started offering free English classes to the cleaning and kitchen staff. What began as a small group in the cafeteria soon transformed into a larger movement. "You don't need to do this," Marcus commented one day, finding her by chance after one of these classes. "It's not your responsibility." Helen faced him, feeling that familiar electricity in the air when they were close. "It's not responsibility, it's choice. I know what it's like to be invisible in this hotel. I also know what it's like to have someone believe in you when no one else does." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken meanings. Marcus took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "You were never invisible to me, Helen. Not since that day in Suite. Phrase 15. Her heart raced, but before she could respond, Arthur appeared in the hallway. "Marcus, we need you in the conference room. The Dutch investors are online." The moment shattered like glass. Marcus stepped away reluctantly. "Keep up the good work, Helen, on all fronts." At night in her small apartment, Helen allowed herself to dream. Not just about professional success, but about possibilities that once seemed as distant as the stars. She wrote in her diary about the shared glances with Marcus, about how her heart raced when he was nearby, about how his deep voice seemed to touch her even when they discussed purely professional matters. But she also wrote about her fears, about how some executives still looked at her as if she were an intruder, about the whispered comments in the hallways, about the small sabotages that began to appear in her path. Important documents that mysteriously disappeared, meetings rescheduled. Without her knowledge, crucial information that arrived too late. One morning, Helen arrived earlier than usual and found her office ransacked. Nothing had been stolen, but her analyses for an important presentation were all disorganized, some pages stained with coffee. On the wall, a yellow post-it note carried a cruel message. "Go back to your place." Her hands trembled as she collected the papers, but her spirit didn't break. With the same determination that had brought her there, she began to rebuild her work. That's how Marcus found her 2 hours later, surrounded by documents and with deep, dark circles, but with a fierce gleam in her eyes. "Who did this?" he asked, his contained voice barely hiding his fury. "It doesn't matter," Helen replied, not taking her eyes off her work. "What matters is that in 3 hours I have a presentation for the board, and it will be perfect." Marcus closed the office door and approached her desk. "Helen, look at me." She obeyed, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart stop for a moment. Concern, admiration, and something more, something that made the air between them seem electrically charged. "You're not alone in this fight," he said softly, his hand finding hers on the desk. The touch, although brief, sent waves of heat throughout her body. "I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, "but I need to win this for myself. I need to prove that I deserve to be here." "You've already proven it," Marcus insisted, his eyes fixed on hers. "Every day, with every report, every analysis, every gesture of generosity with your former colleagues. You are extraordinary, Helen." The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Arthur entered without waiting for an answer, his eyebrows rising when he saw the proximity between them. Marcus stepped away quickly, resuming his professional posture. "The presentation has been moved up to 1 hour from now," Arthur announced, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. "I hope you're ready, Miss Santos." Helen straightened her shoulders, her gaze meeting Marcus's one last time before responding. "I'll be ready, Mr. Mendes. I always am." When she was alone again, Helen touched the hummingbird brooch, feeling the familiar metal under her fingers. "Give me strength, Mum," she whispered to herself. In her mind, she could hear the response. Being good was different from being seen, but she was learning that being seen by those who mattered in the right way could be a form of kindness to herself. The boardroom was packed when Helen entered, carrying her remade presentations and a determination that burned stronger than fatigue. The 16 members of the Royal Hotel's Administrative Board occupied their black leather chairs, all men over 50, except for 2 women who had broken the glass ceiling decades before. The air conditioning blew cold, but Helen felt warm under her navy blue blazer. The same color as her old uniform, a purposeful choice for that day. Marcus occupied the head of the table, his face a mask of professional neutrality that only his eyes, fixed on Helen, contradicted. Arthur was beside him, leafing through papers with poorly disguised anxiety. On the giant wall screen, executives from Amsterdam awaited the start of the presentation, their serious faces reflecting the importance of that moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Helen began, her firm voice filling the environment, "today I will present not just numbers and projections, but a vision of the future for our expansion in the Netherlands." Her fingers glided over the tablet, starting the presentation she had remade in the last hours. A vision built not just with market data, but with a deep cultural and social understanding of the country. For 45 minutes, Helen led that demanding audience through an analysis that went far beyond simple financial projections. She spoke about Dutch consumer behavior trends, about sustainability, a fundamental value in local culture, about how the royal chain could position itself not just as a luxury brand, but as a company that understood and respected the peculiarities of the European market. "Interesting your point about sustainability, Miss Santos," interrupted Willem van der Meer, CEO of the largest Dutch hotel chain, through video conference. "But how do you intend to implement these changes without compromising the luxury standard that characterizes royal hotels?" Helen smiled, discreetly touching her hummingbird brooch. "Excellent question, Mr. van der Meer." She switched to the next slide, revealing a detailed sustainable adaptation project. True luxury in the 21st century isn't just in marble floors or crystal chandeliers, but in environmental and social consciousness. Our studies show that 78% of high-standard guests in Europe are willing to pay more for accommodation in provably sustainable hotels. Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but the implementation costs will be offset in less than 3 years, Helen completed, moving to a detailed spreadsheet of costs and return on investment. And that's without considering the added value to the brand and strategic positioning in the European market. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes shining with something that seemed like pride. "And what about the cultural question? How do you intend to adapt our service standard to the Dutch public?" It was at that moment that Helen felt adrenaline flow stronger in her veins. This was the question she had been waiting for which she had especially prepared. "If you allow me, I'll continue in Dutch, since our Amsterdam partners are present." "What do we?" Followed was a fluent and passionate exposition about Dutch cultural nuances, about how the typical ostentation of luxury hotels would need to be adapted for a culture that values discretion and functionality. She spoke about gezelligheid, the Dutch concept of coziness and conviviality, and how every detail of the hotels could reflect this cultural value. The Dutch executives on the screen smiled and nodded in approval, clearly impressed not just with her command of the language, but with her deep understanding of their culture. Arthur, on the other hand, seemed to have swallowed something particularly bitter. "Impressive, Miss Santos," Willem spoke again, now also in Dutch. "You clearly understand our country better than many consultants we've hired in the past." The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, each slide revealing layers of research and planning that went far beyond what was expected. When Helen finally concluded, the silence in the room was different from any other she had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of invisibility she was accustomed to, but a silence of respect. It was Marcus who broke the silence, rising from his chair. "I believe we have much to discuss. Mr. Vandermeer, can we schedule an in-person meeting in Amsterdam next week?" Agreements began to be made, dates discussed, but Helen barely heard. Her body trembled slightly, the adrenaline beginning to subside. It was when she noticed a small smile on Marcus's lips, a look that said much more than words could express. After the room emptied, Helen remained there, organizing her materials with that same precision she had once applied to her cleaning cart. Marcus returned, closing the door behind. "You didn't just survive today, Helen. You shined." She turned to face him, feeling that familiar electricity in the air between them. "Thank you for believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself." Marcus took a step toward her, his hand lightly touching the hummingbird brooch on her lapel. "This symbol, it means something special, doesn't it?" Helen felt her heart accelerate with the proximity. "It was my mother's. A reminder that we can fly no matter where we come from." The moment was interrupted by a loud knock on the door. Arthur entered, his eyes narrowing when he saw the intimacy of the scene. "Marcus, the Dutch want to confirm some details. And Miss Santos, congratulations." On the presentation, it was adequate. When Arthur left, Marcus sighed deeply. "You're going to Amsterdam with me next week. We need to finalize this negotiation, and I don't trust anyone else to do it." Helen nodded, trying to ignore the whirlwind of emotions that the idea of traveling with Marcus awakened. "I'll be ready." "You always are," he replied, his intense gaze meeting hers one last time before leaving. Alone in the meeting room, Helen finally allowed the tears to come, tears of relief, of pride, of accomplishment. Her reflection in the window glass showed a woman different from the one who used to clean those same windows. But her heart still beat with the same force, now cradled by a feeling she could no longer deny. The Royal Hotel's private jet cut through the Atlantic skies, leaving Manhattan increasingly distant. Helen watched the clouds through the window, trying to calm her heart that insisted on beating erratically since she had boarded. It wasn't just the prospect of her first international trip that left her restless, but the presence of Marcus Rivera, a few meters away, concentrated on his laptop. The luxurious interior of the aircraft was a constant reminder of how much her life had changed in such a short time. Just 6 months ago, she was cleaning executive suites. Now she was flying to Amsterdam in a private jet, carrying responsibilities that would make many experienced executives tremble. "Can't sleep?" Marcus's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He had moved to the seat across from her, offering a glass of red wine. "Too much on my mind," she replied, accepting the drink. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending that familiar electric current through her body. "You're prepared, Helen, more than anyone." She took a sip of wine, allowing the warm liquid to calm her. "It's not just the negotiation that worries me. Arthur sent an email earlier today warning about possible complications in the contract, but he didn't specify which ones." Marcus frowned. "Arthur is resistant to changes. Don't let that shake your confidence." "It's not lack of confidence." Helen adjusted the hummingbird brooch, a gesture that had become her talisman. "It's caution. I learned early that the higher you climb, the greater the fall." Marcus's gaze softened. Sometimes I wonder what your life would be like if I hadn't passed by that suite that day. I wonder too, she confessed, her eyes meeting his, but not about my life, about yours. The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken meanings. Marcus leaned slightly forward, reducing the distance between them. Helen, The sound of his phone cut through the moment. It was Arthur, with urgent information about the Amsterdam meeting. Helen watched while Marcus stepped away to take the call, her heart still accelerated by what could have happened. Amsterdam received them with fine rain and a grey sky that matched Helen's mood on the morning of the decisive meeting. The Luxor. Hotel Amsterdam, still under construction, would be the chain's first in Europe, if the negotiation went well. The meeting room on the top floor of the World Trade Center was packed. Dutch executives, lawyers, financial consultants, all awaiting the final presentation of the project. Helen had spent the night reviewing every detail, every number, every projection. But something bothered her. The complications mentioned by Arthur were still a mystery. It was during her presentation that the first sign of trouble emerged. Willem van der Meer, who had been so receptive in the video conference, now asked incisive questions about discrepancies in the presented numbers. These data are different from what we received in the preliminary proposal, he pointed out, his voice carrying a note of distrust. Helen felt her blood freeze. The numbers really were different, but she hadn't made any changes. Her eyes met Marcus's, who seemed equally surprised. If you'll allow me a moment, she asked in perfect Dutch, maintaining composure while quickly opening her original files on the laptop. It was then that she discovered someone had altered the spreadsheets sent to the Dutch. The alterations were subtle, but significant enough to undermine the credibility of the entire proposal. Gentlemen, Helen addressed the room, her heart beating hard but her voice firm. It seems there was a communication error. Allow me to show the correct numbers, directly from our original database. For 2 tense hours, Helen worked to rebuild the investors' confidence. Every number was verified, every projection justified, every doubt answered with a precision that impressed even the most skeptical. Marcus watched everything with a mixture of pride and concern. During a break, he pulled her to a reserved corner. This wasn't an error, it was sabotage. Helen nodded, exhausted. Arthur, he had access to the final files before sending. I'll take care of that when we return, Marcus promised, his hand discreetly finding hers. But now I need you to focus on saving this negotiation. His touch sent waves of heat through her body, giving her new energy. I won't let them destroy everything we've worked for. The meeting extended until late at night. When it finally ended, the contracts were signed, but the price had been high. The conditions were less favorable than originally planned, a necessary concession to recover the investors' confidence. Helen was at the hotel bar alone with an untouched glass of wine when Marcus found her. Without saying a word, he sat beside her. I failed, she whispered, the tears she had held all day finally threatening to fall. No. Marcus touched her face gently, making her look at him. You saved a negotiation that anyone else would have lost. What happened today wasn't your fault. His proximity, the gentle touch on her face, the intense gaze, everything conspired to make her heart beat even faster. Marcus, Not here, he interrupted softly, although his eyes betrayed the same desire she felt. We have much to resolve when we return to New York. Helen nodded, understanding, but when she got up to leave, she felt his hand hold hers, for a moment longer than necessary. In that touch was a silent promise, a future of possibilities that made all the sacrifice worthwhile. In her room later, Helen removed the hummingbird brooch and held it against her chest. Give me strength, Mom, she whispered to the silence. The path is still long and the fight is just beginning. What she didn't know was that, in his own room several floors above, Marcus Rivera was awake, looking at the lights of Amsterdam, and planning not just how to protect his investment, but how to protect the woman who had, unintentionally, stolen his heart. The return to New York was marked by a silence laden with tension. Helen spent the first days immersed in reports, trying to minimize the damage caused by the sabotage in Amsterdam. Her office had become a refuge where she spent hours beyond normal working hours, reconstituting every detail of the project, every altered number, assembling a dossier that she didn't yet know if she'd have the courage to present. It was on one of those nights, when the clock already marked almost 10 o'clock and the city glittered below like a sea of artificial stars, that Helen discovered something unexpected. While reviewing old archived emails, she found a protected folder with her name. Curiosity overcame hesitation, and after a few attempts, she managed to access it. What she found made her heart stop. There were dozens of evaluation reports about her work, all written by Marcus Rivera, dating from her first day as a cleaning employee, small observations about her professional posture, notes about how she organized her cleaning cart with military precision, comments about conversations in different languages that he occasionally heard her have with foreign guests. Demonstrates natural leadership capacity when organizing the cleaning team's schedules. Read an annotation from 2 years ago. Found studying international economics material during break. Unexploited potential. Recorded another. Exceptional conflict resolution with Dutch guest. Impressive fluency in the language. Yet another observation. Tears began to blur her vision as she continued reading. Marcus hadn't discovered her by chance in that suite. He had been watching her for years, silently accompanying her development, recording her potential. The opportunity she thought had been a stroke of luck had been in reality part of a larger plan. "I thought you would have gone home by now." Marcus's voice startled her. He was standing at her office door, his jacket thrown over his shoulder, his tie slightly loose, signs that his day had been as long as hers. "You knew," Helen said softly, turning the computer screen so he could see the reports. "All this time you knew who I was." Marcus entered the office, closing the door behind him. "Not who you were, Helen, who you could be." "Why?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Why watch me for so long without saying anything?" He approached, leaning against the edge of her desk. "Because you needed to build your own story. I just kept my eyes open for the right moment. Dan, all these reports, all these observations." "Protection," Marcus replied, his intense gaze fixed on her. "Documentation. I knew that eventually I would need to justify your promotion to the board. I needed to prove it wasn't a whim, but a decision based on years of observation and evaluation." Helen stood up, feeling strangely vulnerable. "So everything was calculated?" "The timing of the opportunity, yes. My reaction to you—" He paused, taking a step toward her. "That was never calculated." The air between them became charged with that familiar electricity. Helen could feel the heat emanating from his body, so close to hers. "I found other documents too." "About Arthur?" Marcus nodded gravely. "He's being investigated internally. The sabotage in Amsterdam was just the tip of the iceberg. We found evidence of other manipulations, other compromised projects. Why didn't you tell me you were protecting me?" "For the same reason you hid your formal education while working in cleaning," he replied, his hand finding the hummingbird brooch on her lapel. "Sometimes we need to remain in the shadows so others can shine on their own." His touch on her brooch sent shivers down her spine. "And now?" "Now," Marcus murmured, his voice low and intense, "I don't need to stay in the shadows anymore." The first kiss was soft, hesitant, as if both were testing unknown waters. But it soon transformed into something deeper, years of unresolved tension and repressed feelings finally finding release. Helen's hands tangled in his hair, while his pulled her closer, eliminating any space between their bodies. When they finally separated, breathless, Helen rested her forehead against his. "This complicates everything." "This simplifies everything," he corrected, his fingers tracing the outline of her face. "We don't need to pretend anymore that there isn't something between us." A sound in the hallway made them step apart quickly. Footsteps were approaching. Helen nervously adjusted her blazer, while Marcus moved to a professionally appropriate distance. The door opened, revealing Arthur, who stopped when he saw the scene. His narrow eyes moved between the two, calculating, evaluating. "Sorry, I didn't know anyone was still here." We were discussing the consequences of the Amsterdam fiasco, Marcus replied, his voice perfectly controlled. By the way, Arthur, I'd like to see you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. Arthur's face paled slightly, but he maintained his composure. Certainly. Good night. When the door closed again, Helen released the breath she didn't know she was holding. This is going to cause problems. Marcus took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. Probably. But we'll face them together. The board will have to understand that they can't dictate my personal life, he interrupted gently. Besides, I have years of documentation proving your professional value, independent of any relationship. Helen smiled, touching the hummingbird brooch. My mother always said that being good was different from being seen, but you saw me when I was invisible and still waited for me to prove my worth on my own. And you proved it, more than any other employee in this company, he replied, kissing her softly once more. Now let's go home. Tomorrow will be a long day. While packing her things to leave, Helen looked once more at the computer screen. At all those years of silent observations, her heart was light, despite the complications she knew would come. Because now she understood that she hadn't really been alone in her journey. Someone had been in the shadows, protecting her path, believing in her potential long before she could see it herself. In the elevator, descending together for the first time as more than boss and employee, Helen allowed herself to dream of possibilities that once seemed unattainable. The reflection in the mirror showed two people who had found something rare in the corporate world, a connection that transcended hierarchies and social expectations. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked, noticing her reflective smile. "About how life sometimes surprises us," she replied, gently squeezing his hand, "and about how some people can see through all the layers we build to protect ourselves." His smile in response was all she needed to know that, regardless of the challenges that would come, she was no longer alone in her journey. The hummingbird brooch on her lapel shone under the elevator lights, as if her mother also smiled, approving this new page of her story. The storm began with a whisper on social media. First, there were isolated comments on Royal Hotel's corporate posts. Then, screenshots of her old cleaning employee badge began to circulate. Within hours, the story of the janitor who became an executive went viral, but not in the inspiring way it should have been. Helen discovered it when her assistant entered her office with a pale face, holding a tablet. "I think you need to see this." The headlines were cruel. "Suspicious rise at Royal Hotels raises questions." The comments, even worse. Conspiracy theories about how a cleaning employee had managed to get an executive position spread like wildfire. Her photos being taken out of context, invented stories about supposed previous relationships, insinuations about her intellectual capacity. "Don't pay attention to this," Marcus said when he entered her office, finding her absorbed in the computer screen. "They're just insignificant people trying to diminish something they don't understand." But Helen couldn't take her eyes off the comments. "They're questioning every achievement of mine, Marcus. Every decision, every project. They're even speculating about us." It was true. In the past few hours, old hotel surveillance photos had leaked, showing apparently innocent moments between them. A conversation in the hallway, a smile exchanged in a meeting. The context had been distorted to create a sordid narrative. "We found out who leaked the photos," Marcus informed, his voice tense. "Arthur had access to the security files. He was suspended this morning." Helen touched the hummingbird brooch, seeking strength. "It's not just that. They're contesting my academic training, my language certifications. Someone even suggested my degree is fake." Her phone wouldn't stop vibrating with notifications. Former colleagues from her cleaning days were being harassed by reporters seeking exclusive information. Her life was being publicly dissected, every detail transformed into ammunition against her. "Enough," Marcus closed her laptop firmly. "You don't need to read this." "I do," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to know what they're saying. I need to prepare myself." "Prepare for what?" "To fight." Helen stood up, straightening her shoulders. "I can't let them destroy everything I've built. I can't allow them to use my story to discourage other women who dream of growing professionally. Marcus observed, her with a mixture of admiration and concern. What do you want to do? I want to tell my story on my terms. She began walking around the office, her brain working quickly. I'm going to gather all the women who participated in the development program I created. I'm going to show that I'm not an exception. I'm part of a larger movement. At that moment, Miss Sophia, her former laundry colleague, burst through the door without ceremony. Helen, my dear, did you see what they're doing? There are reporters even at my door. Helen hugged the lady, feeling tears burn in her eyes. Forgive me, Miss Sophia. I never wanted to bring this chaos into your life. What forgiveness, the lady responded fervently. I came here to tell you that all of us, all the girls you helped, are ready to speak, to tell how you gave English classes in the cafeteria, how you reviewed our resumes, how you encouraged us to study. Marcus, who was watching the scene in silence, stepped forward. Helen, use the auditorium, call the press, show who you really are. The next day dawned with the Luxor Hotel auditorium packed. Journalists, executives, employees. All eyes turned to Helen, who was on stage wearing her navy blue blazer and the inseparable hummingbird brooch. My name is Helen Santos, her voice echoed firmly through the speakers. And yes, I was a cleaning employee at this hotel. Yes, I cleaned bathrooms, changed sheets, polished mirrors, and no, I'm not ashamed of it. Cameras flashed as she told her story, not the sensationalist version from social media, but the truth. She spoke about her academic training, about nights of study after exhausting shifts, about her mother's dream of seeing her graduate. But this isn't just my story, she continued, gesturing to the audience. One by one, women stood up. Housekeepers, cooks, cleaning assistants, each with a certificate in hand, each with a story of overcoming to tell. These are the women who participated in our internal development program. Women who, like me, dreamed of something greater. Some have already achieved promotions. Others are studying. Others are still at the beginning of the journey. But they all have something in common: the courage to believe they deserve more. Maria Gonzalez, a young housekeeper, took the microphone with tears in her eyes. Helen taught me English during my breaks. Today, I'm a bilingual receptionist. At the hotel, she never asked for anything in return, just that I study and help other people when I could. One after another, the women shared their stories. The auditorium, which began the morning full of skepticism, now overflowed with emotion. Marcus climbed onto the stage, taking Helen's hand publicly for the first time. Royal Hotels is proud to announce the officialization of the Helen Santos Professional Development Program, which will be implemented in all our global units. The audience exploded in applause. In the front rows, Helen saw Arthur, who had been forced to attend as part of his disciplinary process. His face was contorted in a mask of disgust, but she felt no satisfaction in his defeat, only pity for someone who would never understand the true meaning of growth and transformation. That night, after the cameras had gone away and the auditorium emptied, Helen remained sitting on the stage, exhausted but at peace. Marcus joined her, bringing 2 champagne glasses. To the most extraordinary woman I've ever met, he toasted. Helen smiled, touching her glass to his. To invisibility that transformed into light. Your mother would be proud, he said softly, touching the hummingbird brooch. She is, Helen replied, looking up as if she could see through the ceiling to the stars. And you know what? She was right. Being good is different from being seen. But when you're truly good at what you do, eventually, the world has no choice but to see you. Social media still buzzed with comments, but now the narrative had changed. The story of the janitor who became an executive was no longer a scandal. It was a symbol of hope, proof that barriers can be broken, that dreams can be achieved. And, in the midst of all this transformation, Helen discovered that the true victory wasn't in proving her worth to others, but in remaining true to herself and her principles, even when the world tried to reduce her to stereotypes and prejudices. The morning began differently for Helen. The nausea she had been feeling over the past few weeks finally had a name, a reason, an explanation that made her world spin on a new axis. The pregnancy test, taken almost as a routine check, revealed two pink lines that changed everything. It wasn't just a pregnancy, it was twins, as the emergency ultrasound confirmed a few hours later. Sitting in her office at the Luxor Hotel, Helen observed the city through the panoramic window, her hand unconsciously resting on her still flat belly. The hummingbird brooch seemed heavier today, as if it carried not just her mother's memories, but also the weight of a future that was beginning to unfold in unexpected ways. 6 months had passed since the social media scandal, and her life with Marcus had found its own rhythm, discreet but intense. Their relationship, although still generating whispers in corporate corridors, had established itself as something solid and respectable. But this changed everything. "Miss Santos," her assistant interrupted her thoughts, "the board is waiting for the quarterly report presentation." Helen breathed deeply, adjusting her navy blue blazer. Life didn't stop, even when her personal world was upside down. With firm steps, she headed to the meeting room, where 15 faces awaited her, including Marcus's, who still didn't know he would be a father. The presentation proceeded as expected: numbers, graphs, projections. Helen conducted everything with her usual competence, but her mind was divided between the financial data and the two lives now growing inside her. How to reconcile the executive she had become with the mother she would be. How to balance board meetings with prenatal consultations. When the meeting ended, Marcus called her to his office. "So you're different today," he observed, closing the door. "Is something wrong?" Helen sat down, feeling the weight of the moment. "Not exactly wrong, just unexpected." Her hands trembled slightly when she took the ultrasound from her folder. Marcus looked at the image in silence for long seconds, his eyes gradually widening as he understood what he was seeing. "Are they two?" His voice came out almost in a whisper. "Twins," Helen confirmed, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I know we didn't plan this, that the timing isn't ideal with the European expansion and—" Marcus interrupted her with a kiss, his hands framing her face gently. "The timing is perfect. You're perfect. We're perfect." But corporate reality didn't take long to knock on the door. That same afternoon, during a video conference with Dutch partners, Helen noticed worried looks when she mentioned a possible trip to Amsterdam in the coming months. "Perhaps it would be better to reorganize the schedule," suggested Willem van der Meer, his tone carefully neutral. "Considering future changes." The news of the pregnancy had spread faster than Helen expected. She could already feel expectations changing, plans being remade, people looking at her differently, no longer as the competent executive, but as the pregnant woman who would need to step away. "Nothing has changed," she affirmed firmly. "I can perfectly balance my professional responsibilities with my personal life." But doubts haunted her in the quiet hours. In her apartment that night, Helen found herself rereading old letters from her mother. "How did you do it, Mum?" she whispered to the silence. "How did you raise me alone and still teach me to be so strong?" Marcus found her like this, surrounded by memories and questions. Without saying anything, he sat beside her on the sofa, pulling her into his arms. "I'm scared," she confessed for the first time. "Not of motherhood itself, but of losing everything I've achieved. Of them going back to seeing me as incapable." "That won't happen," he promised, his hand finding hers over her belly. "But if you want, I can step back from the presidency, take on a more advisory role, give you the space to grow even more." Helen pulled back, looking him in the eyes. "No, I don't want concessions. I don't want them to make my path easier. I want to prove that I can be a mother and an executive, that I can have a family and a career. I want our children to grow up seeing that it's possible." A proud smile spread across Marcus's face. "And that's why I fell in love with you. Your strength isn't just in facing challenges, but in transforming them into opportunities." The next morning, Helen arrived at the office with a new purpose. She called a meeting with her team and for the first time shared not just the news of the pregnancy, but also her plans for the future. "I'm going to need everyone's help," she announced. "Not to do my work for me, but to create together a new model of leadership one that proves motherhood and professional success aren't mutually exclusive. The following weeks were of intense preparation. Helen developed a flexible work system that could be adapted during her maternity leave. She implemented remote collaboration tools, trained her team for greater autonomy, and began documenting every important process. On a particularly busy afternoon, she encountered Ms. Sophia in the hallway. The former laundry colleague, now service supervisor, smiled when she saw her belly beginning to show under her blazer. "I knew this would happen," the lady said with a knowing smile. "Since that day I saw you two in the hallway, I was sure love would win." Helen touched the hummingbird brooch, smiling. "Do you think I can do it, Ms. Sophia? Be a mother and continue growing professionally?" "My dear," the lady took her hands in hers, "you're already doing it. Every decision you make, every change you implement, is showing all of us that it's possible. Your children will be born into a better world because of your example." That night, at home, Helen wrote a letter to her unborn children. She told them about her journey, about her mother, about the hummingbird brooch that would one day be theirs. She wrote about Marcus, about love that transcends social barriers, about the courage to break patterns. "You'll be born into a world that still needs to change much," she wrote, "but I promise you'll grow up knowing there are no limits to your dreams. That being good is different from being seen, but that sometimes being seen being good can inspire others to dream too." Marcus found her asleep over the unfinished letter, the hummingbird brooch shining under the lamplight. Carefully he covered her with a blanket, kissed her forehead and whispered to her belly, "You couldn't have chosen a better mother." In the silence of the night, Helen smiled in her sleep, her hands protectively over her belly where two hearts beat in sync with hers. In her dreams, she saw her mother smiling, proud, while two small hummingbirds flew free in the blue sky. The email from the Dutch consulate arrived on a rainy Thursday when Helen was completing her 5th month of pregnancy. The position she had longed for so long was available again, a prestigious position, with all the benefits she had once dreamed of. The deadline to accept was only 1 week. Sitting in her office at the Luxor Hotel, Helen reread the email for the 10th time, her free hand resting on her now visible belly where her twins were growing. The hummingbird brooch seemed heavier than ever, as if it carried the weight of all the decisions she needed to make. She was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. It was Fernanda, a 23-year-old young woman, daughter of a housekeeper and a doorman who had participated in the development program created by Helen. "Excuse me, Miss Helen," Fernanda entered timidly, carrying a folder. "I brought the reports you asked for and, well, I wanted to share some news." Helen smiled, indicating the chair in front of her. In recent months, she had seen Fernanda blossom from a shy reception employee to a confident professional, fluent in 3 languages. "I was accepted to university," Fernanda announced, her eyes shining. "International relations at Columbia, just like you." The pride Helen felt was almost maternal. "Fernanda, that's wonderful. You deserve every achievement." "It's thanks to your program," the young woman continued. "Not just the language classes, but mainly for showing us that it's possible, that people like us can dream big." Helen looked again at the consulate email on her screen, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "Fernanda, have you ever thought about working in diplomatic service?" The conversation that followed was the catalyst Helen needed. That night, after everyone had gone home, she remained in her office developing a new project that would change not just her life, but that of dozens of other people. Marcus found her like this, surrounded by papers and spreadsheets, her eyes shining with that intensity he knew so well. "Shouldn't you be resting?" he asked, massaging her tense shoulders. "I need to show you something first," Helen replied, pulling him to sit beside her. "Remember the consulate position? The one I pursued for years?" Marcus nodded, his expression becoming serious. "They contacted you again?" "Yes, but I'm not going to accept it." She opened a presentation on her laptop. "Instead, I want to propose something bigger, a partnership program between royal hotels and international diplomatic institutions. The project Helen presented was ambitious, a professional development program that would create bridges between the hotel sector and the diplomatic one, offering international career opportunities for employees from humble origins. "Instead of me taking a position at the consulate," she explained, her voice trembling with emotion, "we can create dozens of similar opportunities. We can transform lives on a much larger scale." Marcus studied the project in silence, his eyebrows rising as he understood the magnitude of the proposal. "This goes far beyond our current internal development program." "Exactly. I don't want to just give opportunities within royal hotels. I want to create bridges to the world." Helen touched her hummingbird brooch. "My mother always said that being good was different from being seen. Now I understand that sometimes we need to be seen to be able to do good on a larger scale." Next morning, Helen gathered the board to present her proposal. Her 5-month belly was now a symbol of strength, not fragility, as she explained her vision with the same competence that had brought her there. "Gentlemen," she concluded, "I'm not just asking for approval for a new program. I'm proposing a revolution in how companies can impact lives." The silence that followed was broken by Willem van der Meer, who was participating by video conference from Amsterdam. "It's ambitious," he commented, "but if anyone can make this work, it's you, Helen." The approval was unanimous. In the following weeks, Helen worked tirelessly to structure the program. Her afternoons were divided between meetings with consulates, curriculum development, and prenatal consultations. It was during one of those afternoons that Fernanda returned to her office, this time carrying a letter from the Dutch consulate. She had been the first candidate approved by the new program. "You're giving up your own dream," Fernanda said, tears in her eyes. Helen smiled, standing up to hug the young woman. "I'm not giving it up. I'm transforming it into something bigger. Sometimes our dreams need to grow to embrace other people." The program was officially launched in a ceremony at the Luxor Hotel Auditorium, the same place where months before Helen had faced criticism from social media, now witnessed the beginning of a new era. On stage, her 5-month belly visible under her navy blue dress, Helen presented the first 20 program participants, all employees from humble origins, all with stories of overcoming similar to her own. "Today we're not just launching a program," she declared. "We're planting seeds of transformation. Each person here represents dozens of others who will come after. Each success story will be a beacon of hope for those who don't yet dare to dream." Marcus, sitting in the front row, couldn't contain his pride. When Helen descended from the stage, he hugged her publicly, his hands resting on her belly where their children were growing. "You never cease to amaze me," he whispered in her ear. "I'm just getting started," she replied, a radiant smile on her face. "Our children will grow up seeing that it's possible to change the world, one dream at a time." That night at home, Helen wrote in her diary, "Today I understood that some dreams need to die so that others, bigger ones, can be born. Like a phoenix that rises from the ashes, my old desire to work at the consulate transformed into something much more significant. Mom, you taught me to be good even when no one was watching. Now I use this visibility I've achieved to multiply good, and your grandchildren, when they're born, will grow up knowing that true success isn't in climbing alone, but in lifting others while you climb." The hummingbird brooch, always present on her lapel, shone under the lamplight, no longer a symbol of individual dreams, but of collective flights, of shared freedom, of transformation on a much larger scale than she had ever imagined possible. The old laundry warehouse of the Luxor Hotel had been completely transformed. The old industrial machines had given way to an elegant but welcoming space, with exposed brick walls and apparent steel beams that told the history of the place. Arrangements of white flowers and hanging foliage hung from the ceiling, creating a suspended garden that softened the industrial architecture. Helen observed the transformation of the space through the mirror while adjusting her wedding dress, a simple but elegant model that embraced her 7-month belly. The hummingbird brooch, now accompanied by a smaller pair of identical brooches for the twins, rested over her heart. "Who would have thought," Miss Sophia commented, helping her with the veil. That day when you used the sweet phone would change so much. Tears threatened to blur her makeup, but Helen held them back. Her gaze wandered through the space that had once been her workplace, now transformed into the setting for her wedding. The decision to hold the ceremony there hadn't been just symbolic. It was a declaration that her story, with all its layers, deserved to be celebrated. The hall was filled with guests who represented all phases of her journey. In the front row, hotel employees, housekeepers, waitresses, cleaning assistants, all wearing navy blue in honor of the uniform that once united them. Among them, the 20 participants of the first cycle of the International Development Program, including Fernanda, who would soon leave for her internship at the Dutch consulate. Executives and board members occupied the following rows, many still surprised by the choice of venue, but all respectfully present. Willem van der Meer had flown from Amsterdam especially for the occasion, bringing with him a proposal to expand the development program to other European countries. The music began softly, an orchestrated version of an old American song her mother used to sing. Helen breathed deeply, holding the bouquet of white flowers where a small portrait of Grace was delicately attached. "Ready?" Miss Sophia asked, offering her arm. Helen nodded, unable to contain her smile. The lady had insisted on walking her to the altar, taking the role her mother would have played. More than ever. The doors opened and Helen began her last walk as a single woman. The central aisle was covered with white petals, and dozens of candles floated in glass containers, creating an almost magical atmosphere. But her eyes were fixed on Marcus, who awaited her at the improvised altar. An old industrial washing machine transformed into an artistic structure covered with flowers. Each step was a memory. She passed the place where she used to organize her cleaning cart, now occupied by a flower arrangement. She walked over the floor she had polished so many times, today covered by an elegant carpet. The air that once smelled of cleaning products was now perfumed with jasmine and roses. When she reached the altar, Marcus took her hand, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "You look absolutely stunning," he whispered. The ceremony was conducted in English and Dutch, a tribute to the language that had been a bridge to so many transformations. The vows were simple but profound, speaking not just of love, but of respect, growth, and transformation. "Helen," Marcus began his vows, "you taught me that true power isn't in commanding but in elevating. That success isn't a solitary achievement, but a shared journey. I promise to be by your side not as your superior or protector, but as a partner in all the flights yet to come." Tears now flowed freely down Helen's face as she pronounced her own vows. "Marcus, you saw me when I was invisible, but you had the wisdom to wait for me to make myself visible by my own merits. I promise to honor that trust every day, being not just your wife but your partner in the mission to transform other lives." The rings were brought by Fernanda, nestled in a small navy blue pillow. When Marcus slid the ring onto her finger, Helen felt the babies move, as if they too were participating in that moment. After the ceremony, the space transformed into a party hall where hierarchies dissolved and true celebrations took place. Executives danced with housekeepers, directors shared stories with cleaning assistants, and in the center of it all, Helen and Marcus danced their first waltz as husband and wife. "Look," Marcus whispered in her ear during the dance, indicating a corner of the hall with a discreet movement. Helen saw Fernanda talking animatedly with Willem van der Meer about her plans for the consulate internship. Near them, other program participants shared their stories with international executives, planting seeds for future opportunities. "This is bigger than us," Helen replied, moved. "It's a legacy." The party continued well into the night, but it was a quiet moment that remained forever etched in Helen's memory. She found a minute of solitude near the old drying area, now transformed into a winter garden. There, touching the 3 hummingbird brooches, she whispered a prayer of gratitude to her mother. Marcus found her in this moment of reflection. "Thinking about your mother?" "Thinking about everything," she replied, leaning into him. "About how life comes full circle, about how that invisible employee transformed into all this." You were never invisible, he corrected gently. You were just waiting for the right moment to fly. That night, when the last guest left and the lights began to dim, Helen and Marcus remained for a moment in the empty hall. The space still held echoes of the celebration, but also carried memories of all the days of hard work that had paved the way there. "You know what my mother always said?" Helen asked, her hand intertwined with his, while the other rested on her belly. That being good was different from being seen. And what do you think about that now? A smile lit up her face. I think she was right. But I also think that when you're truly good, the universe finds a way to make you seen. And then, it's up to you to use that visibility to light the path for others. Marcus kissed her forehead softly. And that's exactly what you do every day. As they left the hall, Helen cast one last look at the space that had witnessed so many transformations. The hummingbird brooch shone under the last light like a promise that new flights were yet to come. Not just for her, but for all the other women who somewhere were still waiting for their chance to be seen. In her womb, the twins moved once more, as if sealing that moment with their own approval. Helen smiled, knowing they would be born into a slightly better, slightly fairer world, thanks to the courage of a woman who once dared to dream beyond the cleaning cart. And so, the story of the invisible employee who transformed into a vision